Good afternoon. Welcome. We're happy to have you joining us this afternoon for our Sunday afternoon 3 p.m. Sermon. The worship service, of course, is limited just to our Sunday morning 11 a.m. in person, and we would heartily welcome you if you're able to come and join us for that. Do check our website, bagdadcofc.org, for some guidance on what kind of things we'll be practicing to remain safe from the pandemic as we meet together on that Sunday morning service. But our Sunday afternoon service will be limited just to a pre-recorded sermon like this one, and also our Wednesday evening service at 6 p.m. We're not having that in person, but we will be having the Bible lesson posted for you to view if you'd like at that time. Also, check our webpage again for links to the Sunday morning Bible study class. Brother Rick Wade is providing that, and we'll have a link to it on the website that you can go right to it and see his Bible lesson for the Sunday morning service. We won't be meeting for that at 10 o'clock, but we will be having it recorded for you. This afternoon, we'd like to again welcome all who are able to join us for a study, and our Sunday afternoon sermons have been styled for the last few months as a overview look at each of the books of the Bible, one per Sunday, beginning back with the book of Genesis. And so far we've covered all the way through the books of the law, the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. We've covered the books of history up through Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And then we began to look at the books of poetry, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. And last week we wrapped up our study of the book of Ecclesiastes. So that brings us to the next book, which is the last of the books of poetry, called the Song of Solomon, or sometimes it's simply called the Song of Songs. And we don't study this one much, I guess because people get a little bit shaky when they think about how the sexuality of human marriage is portrayed in this book. But it is a very important book. It's an important book not just for historical purposes, but it delves into the relationship between husband and wife, and more so than that, it brings up the connection between God and his people Israel. It brings up the relationship between the parts of the Godhead, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. And it also addresses the relationship of Jesus, the Son of God, to the church, which is his body that he established on this earth. So what we're looking at here is a book that has many different facets to it. The book called Song of Solomon, or Song of Songs, is really about love. It is simply a book about love. God's primary purpose here, it seems like to me, was to give us a revelation concerning the way that love works between a man and a woman, and how that love should look. He's not talking here just about the esoteric, type of love we talk about sometimes, but in this, Solomon gets down to the very details of it. Some of the physical features of love between a man and a woman. And the characters in this book actually are examples of how one should behave between men and women, how a person should behave, and how their actions and activities should contribute to that relationship. So it's a very interesting type of book. Solomon, of course, was a man who had many wives. We know that, as we're told in the scriptures. But this song, or this writing that he engages in here, seems like it's related to the most precious of his wives, the most beautiful, the most outstanding relationship, which we could maybe realize as the very first one. Maybe that's what he's writing about. It harkens back, though, to what God put in place. The Song of Solomon tells us about the type of love that God describes in his Word. And it goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden, where God described the relationship between a man and a woman. And that kind of love that we read about there, as you can see, we're going to be comparing some things on the screen. Here, The Song of Solomon is about love between a man and a woman. And that relationship is one that stands out above all others in a physical sense, and maybe that's why Solomon writes about it. But it also is a relevant message. It's a message that's relevant for us today. In God's plan, men and women still engage in these activities that are based on love. Sometimes we get an overall picture of a book, and it helps us understand what it's about. In this one, Solomon writes in kind of stages. It's like the parts of a drama, the acts of a play, if you will. And he writes about three main speakers here: the bride, the Shulamite woman, and then the beloved, the king, Solomon himself, and later on, a kind of a chorus. The daughters of Jerusalem chime in with their insights to the whole thing. But what we want to do in our study this afternoon, we don't have time to go into every possible detail. It's not that easy to get into every detail of this book in the time we have available. But just think about the context of this. When Solomon wrote this, it was at a time when there was a high premium placed upon offspring and having children, and a woman was often measured, her worth was calculated in terms of the number of children that she bore to her husband. Well, the interesting thing about this book here that we're studying is that Solomon does not mention that. This relationship he speaks of is about the relationship physically between a man and a woman, and it is describing sex in terms of joy, for union, for relationship, for celebration. The lyrics of the Song of Solomon contain no aspirations to pregnancy, contains nothing at all about anticipating parenthood. Its focus is not on progeny, to produce offspring for keeping your future alive and continuing the line of the king. No, instead it is based upon the passion of the relationship between physical beings and expresses the commitment that a husband and wife should have with each other. So as we begin to talk about this, just think about it. It's about love between man and woman. It's also about the love that God had for his people Israel. As we see many times in the scriptures, there are pictures that are brought up, images that can be interpreted many different ways. They're not always just exactly what they say. And as we see here, we're going to be able to tell that God is describing for us in this book something about his relationship to his people, Israel, his bride, if you will. And then, as we go a little farther, we also notice that this can be a relationship descriptively between Christ and the church. In Ephesians chapter 5, Paul writes there about how a husband should love his wife as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. It's a relationship that parallels the husband and wife relationship. So, as we begin our study, like I said, we don't have time to touch on every detail, but let's talk about some things that kind of get us rolling here. The first part of the Song of Solomon is that it is devoted to not sexual activity, but sexual restraint. Now that's a strange thought in our world today, where sex is not thought of as being restrained in any fashion. Everybody is more prone to jump into a sexual relationship. But this book tells us about the restraint as courtship takes place. Let's take just a moment and look at a couple of the passages here from the first part of this. The Song of Songs, which is Solomon's, and the first opening here is the Shulamite. This is the woman. Shulamite, we're not sure exactly what that means, but we know that she was from the town of Shulam. That's what Shulamite means. It also is mentioned later in the book that she is from the area of Lebanon, to the north of Israel. But here she begins to describe right off in this book some feelings that she has. The Shulamite says, "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, For your love is better than wine, because of the fragrance of your good ointments. Your name is ointment poured forth, therefore the virgins love you. Draw me away, she says. Okay, there's some courtship going on here. When we read a little farther, she tells about how their eyes meet, how their countenances kind of merge as they notice each other. Down in verse 5, she says, I am dark but lovely, O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon. Do not look upon me because I am dark. Well, now she's not necessarily saying she is of dark skin, but she may be referring to the fact that she thinks herself to not be the perfection of beauty that others may think about it. She says, the sun has tanned me, so maybe she was an outdoor type woman. But then she begins to speak in verse 7 to her beloved. Tell me, O you whom I love, where you feed your flock, where you make it rest at noon. For why should I be as one who veils herself by the flocks of your companions? She is describing her beginning to notice something about this man, and would like to know more about him. What exactly is he all about? This courtship will be followed by a description of the wedding. Now, to put things in perspective a little bit, the outstanding thing about this is that she restrains her sexual desire during this time of courtship. When she describes the effect that seeing Solomon has on her, it is not with the desire to just immediately jump into a sexual relationship. No, it's a kind of an exchange where both she and the beloved, or Solomon, sort of exchange these interesting thoughts about each other. Let's turn over to chapter 6 and at verse 3. This is where the daughters of Jerusalem are putting in their 2 cents worth. And the Shulamite responds to them. She says, I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. He feeds his flock among the lilies. All right. Well, she sees there are each others. They belong to each other in a sense that Solomon has this impact on her, makes her want to be with him. But as always, they follow the rules that were set up by God, and that is they did not engage in sexual activity. There's nothing in this first part down through about the 3rd chapter and about verse 5 that tells us that they actually did anything. They did not. They were chaste. The dramatic image that we see here is kind of like a couple staring deeply into each other's eyes, and they do it in a loving manner. They begin to notice each other. Somewhere in here doves are mentioned, I think, and doves were an example of tranquility in the Eastern culture. So Solomon returns her gaze by commenting on her beauty. If we turn back to chapter 2, the beloved, this is Solomon, he speaks to her, like a lily among thorns, so is my love among the daughters. The Shulamite responds with her thoughts about Solomon, like an apple tree among the trees of the woods, so is my beloved among the sons. I sat down in his shade with great delight, and his fruit was sweet to my taste. This is a description, I think, of what she was feeling for him. Now, the Shulamite describes herself as rather common. She doesn't think that she is worthy of this outstanding beauty that he lays upon her. In chapter 1 of the Song of Solomon, verses 9 and 10, Solomon says, I have compared you, my love, to my filly among Pharaoh's chariots. Your cheeks are lovely with ornaments, your neck with chains of gold. All right, so he's lavishing praise upon her, and maybe that's good. That's what a man should do, would be to praise the one whom he loves. And he responds to her thoughts about his goodness and beauty with some thoughts about her, and she's not common. He says she's a rare beauty, one that is noticed among the other flowers that are present. So in chapter 2, starting in about verse 3, we read earlier where the Shulamite says about her beloved, that he's like an apple tree among the trees of the woods. He's outstanding. He's a different type of tree. And she describes him as one whom is attracting her attention. So this period of courtship, though, is unique because it's so different from what we find in the world today. So far, the things that we're reading about are things that God has instructed His people to abide by. Whenever any couple falls in love, it is kind of like springtime to them. And as we read there in Solomon's account, there is this sort of springtime atmosphere that they begin to engage in. They have this feeling of a new start, a new beginning, and that's interesting. Their lives are fresh. They have become new, and they start to think about it in that way. Now, true enough, there is the desire to be alone with one's lover. That's natural. That's a very natural and legitimate feeling. Unfortunately, it sometimes gets carried away. It leads to fornication. It leads to carrying out sexual activity which shouldn't be taking place. And sometimes it even departs after marriage. There's this letdown period. So that's something there. But if you go back to chapter 2, let's take a look at verse 14. And here, the Shulamite, the woman, is speaking to her beloved. She says, "O my dove, in the clefts of the rock, in the secret places of the cliff, let me see your face, let me hear your voice. For your voice is sweet, and your face is lovely." She was describing this urge, this desire to be alone with her lover. Down in verse 15, she even brings up something that is kind of interesting. She says, "Catch us the foxes, the little foxes that spoil the vixen, for our vines have tender grapes." She's not really telling the beloved to go and catch foxes. There may have been some problems between them. Foxes, one commentary says, may refer to something that had happened in their relationship. Maybe they had a spat of some kind, and she was telling him to get rid of those foxes that could damage their relationship. Even though they had these problems that they faced, though, they overcame them. And the real picture we get here in these early chapters, chapter 1, 2, and 3, is that the song does not portray sex as the great and final goal to experience true joy. No, the song here that Solomon writes doesn't suggest that mutual admiration of the lovers, their physical bodies, and their sensuality is the source of joy. It is a kind of joy, yes, but it's not the source of real joy. Instead, what this song does, and the thoughts contained within it, associates the joy of the heart between two who love each other with the final commitment of marriage. So we begin to merge into the picture of the wedding here. It is only in that relationship, in that marriage relationship, that they realize their freedom to express the joys of physical love without restraint. That's the wonderful thing about what picture we get here. In our society today, people want to just jump immediately to the physical gratification of their desires, and having sex is sometimes one of the first things that is in a relationship. And it's not the whole story. It should be reserved. It should be that part which is kept aside, waiting until there is the freedom to realize this relationship without restraint, knowing that marriage is the place and the bond that seals those two together. When I was young, I guess I'm really back in the olden days, but my culture that I grew up in, me and my friends and associates, the idea was that if you desired sex with a woman, then marriage is how you achieve that. Marriage was the way in which you gained access to sex. And things have changed a lot. And we know that modern society, being driven by people in our society that think they know it all, our contemporary popular people and the celebrities that people look up to, and even politicians and sports figures and all that, entertainers and so on, have this idea that you should gratify those desires immediately. And so marriage is not required to achieve it. But what we find here in Song of Solomon is different. It tells us about this courtship which leads to the wedding, and starting in chapter 3, we read about the picture of this wedding that's going to take place, beginning in verse 6 of chapter 3. You'll turn in your Bible there. The Shulamite says, "Who is this coming out of the wilderness like pillars of smoke, perfumed with myrrh and frankincense, with all the merchants' fragrant powders? Behold, it is Solomon's couch, with 60 valiant men around it. Of the valiant of Israel, they all hold swords," she says. "And being expert in war, every man has his sword on his thigh because of fear in the night. Of the wood of Lebanon, Solomon the king made himself a palanquin." Palanquin is kind of like a podium of some sort. But here we are, she continues and says, "He made its pillars of silver, its support of gold, its seat of purple, its interior paved with love by the daughters of Jerusalem. Go forth, O daughters of Zion, and see King Solomon with the crown, with which his mother crowned him on the day of his wedding, the day of the gladness of his heart." So there's her impression of this wedding day which is coming. Weddings back in those days were divided into 3 parts. First, the groom's parents selected a bride for their son. They did the choosing. That was done with some permission. The bride's parents had to agree, and both the bride and the groom generally had to themselves approve of this marriage. And they were arranged, but there was a lot of input from the people involved. Secondly, on the wedding day, the groom would go to the bride's house, accompanied by a group of his friends, and he would escort her to the site of the wedding ceremony, and finally then took her to their new residence, accompanied by the friends, and that evening is when the marriage was consummated, the night after the wedding ceremony took place. The third feature was this public proclamation of the wonderful event, which involved feasting with their friends, usually for 7 days. That would be cool to have a 7-day feast after your wedding nowadays. But this marriage procession, which is described here, is important. It is the practice of showing and making legal the contract of marriage. Marriage is an important event, and it's not something which is to be looked down upon. It's a special event. It's a wonderful thing. And that's one reason I believe that couples considering marriage, or maybe those who are newly married, could do a lot for themselves by studying the book of Song of Solomon. Not just reading it, but studying it, looking at all the pictures and the insights which it can give. All of that is contained in this picture of the wedding that they are to engage in. And then finally, that part which everybody seems to think is so important is the consummation of the marriage. And I read something from chapter 4 that just kind of makes me think. Let's read down through verse 7. Here's Solomon writing, the beloved says, "Behold, you are fair, my love. Behold, you are fair. You have dove's eyes behind your veil. Your hair is like a flock of goats going down from the Mount Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of sheep shorn, which have come up from the washing, every one of which bears twins, and none is barren among them. Your lips are like a strand of scarlet. Your mouth is lovely. Your temples behind your veil are like a piece of pomegranate. Your neck is like the Tower of David, built for an armory, on which hang 1,000 bucklers, all shields of mighty men. Your 2 breasts are like 2 fawns, twins of a gazelle, which feed among the lilies. Until the day breaks and the shadows flee away, I will go my way to the mountain of myrrh and to the hill of frankincense. You are all fair, my love, and there is no spot in you." Think about what he says there. It sounds to me like Solomon is ravished by the beauty of this woman, by the beauty of his bride. He praises all those things about her which are beautiful. And Solomon uses some common things from his background maybe to describe, like her hair being like a flock of goats. Well, goats traditionally in that culture had black coats, and descending from the mountains at dusk, they might look like long flowing hair. Sheep were white, which resembled the perfection of her teeth. The pomegranate, rosy cheeks that we are sometimes talking about, and a long neck. A long neck was a place to hang many ornaments. That long and graceful neck of hers would be the resting place for many wonderful ornaments that she was entitled to. And of course, we understand these pictures. We're not offended by them. We're trying to understand here that Solomon is simply giving us a picture of this perfection that he saw in his wife. Well, maybe she wasn't really as perfect as he thought, but to him, it was true. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, we're told. And Solomon found this wife, this woman, to be perfect for him. And that's the way it should be. The bride's love kind of reflects that. The bride tells about the greatness of her thoughts about Solomon. And then we get to chapter 5, and we start to look at a maturing process. A process of where this marriage begins to solidify. Now, we're looking here at some time passing, I think. Some time passing. The married love of Solomon and the Shulamite is in view here. And again, the stages of love are not without their problems. The king and his bride work through their problems, but these chapters here, chapter 5, 6, 7, 8, give us some insight as to how those problems were solved. And we may not have time to cover all of this in our sermon this afternoon. We'll come back to it for the next one. But think about what happens in a real marriage. There is a maturing process in chapter 5 and verse 2. The Shulamite says, I sleep, but my heart is awake. It is the voice of my beloved. He knocks, saying, Open for me, my sister, let my love, my dove, my perfect one, for my head is covered with dew, my locks with the drops of the night. He goes on to describe that perhaps he is interested in physical love. He's interested in lovemaking. And there is something about this. It's not right, though. The woman has lost interest. She gives a weak excuse, maybe. She says, well, I'm already ready for bed. And so, or she might claim having a headache or something, but she does not open to him. And because of that, he goes away. And now she goes to the door and finds that now he's not there. So this presents a problem. What's going to happen? And this is not out of the ordinary. There is something which can happen when married people drift apart, when there's some times when they're not on the same wavelength, you might say. Nevertheless, though, the Shulamite woman still loves Solomon very much. She was his wife, he was her husband, and she continues to have this descriptive nature about what she loves about him. In chapter 5, we go a little bit farther, and she describes him, let's see. She says, My beloved is white and ruddy, chief among 10,000. His head is like the finest gold. His locks are wavy and black as a raven. His eyes are like doves by the rivers of waters, washed with milk and fitly set. His cheeks are like a bed of spices. And so on she goes. What's she doing there? She's reminding herself of why she loves him. This might be something that we can find in marriages nowadays. If there are rocky times, why not go back to what was the kindling fire to begin with? And that's what this woman does. She goes back and describes in her resolving of all this, she finds that she is still attracted to him, and his love is something important to her. And finally, they are restored. In chapter 6, we read about, in figurative sense anyway, how that they are resolved. Now, again, they get back to this process of physical love once more, and they begin to see how this works for them to bring about the real love that they should have had all along. I see that our time is about up for this evening, so we're going to stop at this point. There are some details we'd like to cover in the remaining part of our sermon here, and we'll do that next week, starting with a more detailed look at these processes that we're talking about. But I would encourage you, if you have a chance, take the book of Song of Solomon. It's only 8 chapters. Read through it. Read it with the eye of what are they trying to tell us in figurative language. And you'd be surprised how much there is to learn there. We do appreciate everyone's tuning in for our recorded broadcast this afternoon. Please make use of the comments section if you have any questions or concerns or insights about the lesson. We hope to see you again on Sunday or Wednesday when we have our recorded Bible study period then, and also again on Sunday for the 11 a.m. worship service here at the building. Be aware of all those that need our attention, and we wish that God's blessings will be upon you, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.